Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to a continuing series of webinars, Ideas, Interests, Institutions, and Nation-State Climate Politics. I'm Todd Eisenstadt. I'm a professor of government in the School of Public Affairs and also research director at the Center for Environmental Policy. We are really happy to have a very distinguished panel today to discuss loss and damage as the third pillar of climate action. Our panelists are going to discuss climate adaptation as it applies internationally, in European cases, in Caribbean cases, and right here in the District of Columbia. So I have three very distinguished guests today to speak with us. We have Adele Thomas, who's the director of the Climate Change Adaptation and Resilience Research Center at the University of the Bahamas, as well as being a senior research associate at Climate Analytics. And she's also a lead author at the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and a negotiator on behalf of the group of small island nations in the United Nations climate change negotiations. So we will start off with Dr. Thomas. We also have with us Lisanne Gurun, who is a postdoctoral researcher at the Open University of the Netherlands, working on an ADAPT lock-in research project on climate change adaptation policy lock-ins. And she does work especially on conservation in the Netherlands, Germany, and the United Kingdom. After Dr. Gurun, we have Kelly Crawford, who is the Associate Director of the Washington, D.C. Department of Energy and Environment, where she leads a team of air quality professionals to ensure working to monitor and reduce air pollution in the District of Columbia is achieved. And so I'm going to start off, please, with Adele Thomas and thank all of our panelists for joining us today.
Thanks, Todd. And hello, everyone. Very happy to be here. So my talk today is on loss and damage as the third pillar of climate action. When we think about climate action and climate policy, then there's this large focus on mitigation, which are reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and also a lesser focus on adaptation, which is putting in place measures to reduce impacts and risks of climate change. But what we are increasingly seeing is that despite mitigation and adaptation, negative impacts of climate change are already occurring. Climate change isn't some distant or far off issue. We're already seeing impacts of climate change happening now. And so developing countries and small island developing states, or SIDS in particular, have strongly advocated that loss and damage must be part of a holistic approach to addressing climate change. And really that loss and damage should be the third pillar of climate action, along with both mitigation and adaptation. So you can see in this picture here, the foreign minister from Tuvalu giving a speech while knee deep in water, and this was just last year. And he was highlighting that climate change is already having severe impacts in his country, and that sea level rise threatens to result in the loss of territory and forced movement of communities. And so this is just one example of SIDS in particular being very vocal about being at the front lines of climate change, already experiencing severe negative impacts, and really pushing for loss and damage to be this third pillar of climate action. But despite this advocacy, we have seen very little progress, either in the global policy arena or by vulnerable countries themselves, in actually developing policies and mechanisms to address loss and damage. Loss and damage has very much remained in the discussion space with little concrete action. And so in my talk today, I'm going to focus on how loss and damage has very slowly evolved in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, and how that slow progress in the UNFCCC has been mirrored with limited policy and action for loss and damage at the national scale in small islands. I'll also discuss some of the factors that are leading to limited national action on loss and damage in small islands in particular. And then finally, I'll look at some recent developments in the scientific literature and within the UNFCCC that might provide sort of a push for increased action and attention for loss and damage. So first, I'd like to discuss a bit, what is it that we mean by loss and damage? One of the major challenges associated with this issue is that there's lack of a universal definition. Loss and damage means different things to different people. And so here's a visualization of how different groups understand loss and damage. This is from an important study that was done by Boyd et al. And they've grouped understandings or perspectives of loss and damage into 4 main categories. There are those that think of loss and damage in the adaptation and mitigation perspective. And here, all negative impacts of climate change can be considered loss and damage, but mitigation and adaptation should be sufficient to prevent loss and damage from occurring. And so with this perspective, then there isn't a need for specific action on loss and damage, since adaptation and mitigation should prevent all negative impacts from happening. Then there's those with a risk management perspective. And in this framing, there is an understanding that loss and damage can occur. But in this perspective, addressing loss and damage can best be achieved through risk management and enhancing adaptation. So there's not a need for specific action on loss and damage, but rather an expansion of adaptation efforts. The third perspective is the limits to adaptation framing. And this perspective acknowledges that adaptation has limits and it cannot prevent all negative impacts from happening. And so in this limits to adaptation perspective, there is a need for specific action on loss and damage. And the final perspective is existential. And in this framing, climate change can result in unavoidable transformation of communities and systems, as well as irreversible loss. So that would be things like loss of territory. And so here there is a sense of urgency to have specific action on loss and damage. As you can see in the figure, these framings overlap. They are not distinct from each other. But what this figure also shows us is that there are differences in which countries and in which groups mostly associate with different framings. So we see developed countries in this peach color, mostly agreeing with the adaptation and mitigation perspective. And so not really seeing the need for there to be separate action for loss and damage. Meanwhile, in this blue and yellow color, we see the SIDS and the least developed countries largely falling into the limits to adaptation and the existential perspectives. And so understanding loss and damage as a separate issue apart from adaptation and mitigation and in need of separate action. And so this helps us to understand a bit why historically there hasn't been a universal call for loss and damage to be this third pillar of climate action. And this lack of a common understanding of loss and damage is not particularly helped by how loss and damage is framed in the UNFCCC. So the main reference in the United Nations framework states that loss and damage associated with the adverse effects of climate change includes, and in some cases involves more than, that which can be reduced by adaptation. So this in some ways points to a limits to adaptation framing where there is a need for specific action on loss and damage, but it's also not completely clear. And actually keeping the definition of loss and damage purposely vague in the UNFCCC has allowed negotiators with different perspectives to agree to include loss and damage. But this UNFCCC reference does vaguely allude to the relationship between mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage. And it does sort of highlight the need to consider loss and damage as a separate but connected issue. And so now moving into how loss and damage has been reflected in the international policy arena. Loss and damage has a really long history, actually preceding development of the UNFCCC. In 1989 and 1990, the United Nations General Assembly issued resolutions that identified the possible adverse effects of sea level rise on islands and coastal areas and recommend that this issue was considered during upcoming discussions of a draft framework convention on climate. And that's what would ultimately become the UNFCCC. During the lead up to developing the UNFCCC, the newly formed Alliance of Small Island States, AOSIS, first raised the issue of loss and damage in a submission in 1991. And in this submission, they called for the development of an insurance pool to be part of the UNFCCC. And this insurance pool would compensate SIDS for loss and damage coming from sea level rise in particular. However, this proposed insurance pool that was submitted by AOSIS was not accepted, and it did not become part of the convention when it was established in 1992. Instead, the UNFCCC made general reference to insurance that may be necessary to meet the specific needs and concerns of developing country parties. So no specific mention of loss and damage, but inclusion of insurance as a possible need. As the UNFCCC progressed, then there was really a large focus on mitigation, so reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And so we didn't see insurance popping up again formally in the UNFCCC until 2001. And this is when the Conference of Parties agreed to hold a series of workshops to explore the implementation of insurance-related actions. We saw these workshops taking place 2 years later in 2003, and the outcome of that was a report. And then in 2004, the COP again agreed to hold workshops exploring adaptation, risk management, risk reduction, and insurance, and to have those workshops by 2007. And in 2007, AOSIS made another submission, again calling for development of an insurance mechanism. So you can see this very sustained push from AOSIS to address impacts from sea level rise in particular, and also the focus of the UNFCCC in responding to this by holding these workshops and developing reports, but no actual mechanisms being put in place. And so it's actually not until 2007 when the term loss and damage is used explicitly for the first time in the UNFCCC. And this was in the context of calls for enhanced action on adaptation as part of the Bali Action Plan. And so here we see loss and damage being lumped as part of adaptation. In 2010, loss and damage finally made its way into a COP decision when COP16 established a work program to consider approaches to address loss and damage as part of the Cancun adaptation framework. So again here, this link between loss and damage and adaptation. And that work program consisted of submissions, expert meetings, workshops, synthesis reports, technical papers. All of this work aims at clarifying what the UNFCCC should do to address loss and damage. Finally, in 2013, so this is over 20 years after AOSIS first sought a mechanism to address loss and damage, the COP decided to establish an international mechanism to address loss and damage. And this was called the Warsaw International Mechanism, or the WIM. And an executive committee of the WIM was also established to carry out its work. However, this decision to establish the WIM did not open up new or additional finance for loss and damage. And so it was unclear how the activities of the WIM to address loss and damage would be funded. And I'll get a bit more into the mandate of the WIM in the next slide. In 2014, we saw the first 2-year work plan for the executive committee being approved. And then the next momentous date was in 2015, when loss and damage was anchored in the Paris Agreement as its own article, Article 8. And this was a separate article of the Paris Agreement, which firmly established loss and damage as being separate and apart from mitigation and adaptation. But again, here in Article 8, no specific language on funding for loss and damage was included in the Paris Agreement. In 2016, the first review of the WIM was conducted to assess how well the WIM was meeting its objectives. And in 2017, the Fiji Clearinghouse for Risk Transfer was launched. This clearinghouse serves as a repository for information on insurance and risk transfer. So here we see this theme of insurance being picked up. But this Fiji Clearinghouse is not an actual insurance facility. It doesn't provide insurance. What it does is it's aimed at enhancing knowledge and understanding of risk transfer solutions and insurance. In 2019, the second review of the WIM was conducted, and also the Santiago Network on Loss and Damage was established. And I'll talk about that in a few slides. And then at COP26 just last year, loss and damage really came into the spotlight with very strong advocacy from developing countries on the need for a loss and damage finance facility. And so at COP26, we saw loss and damage being all over the media. And for some, this was really the first time that they were aware of loss and damage, even though it has this very long history. But the outcomes at COP26 fell short of these expectations. There was some progress made on the Santiago Network, and there was also the establishment of the Glasgow Dialogue that will be focused on funding for loss and damage. So no commitment of funding, but rather continued discussions on what funding may be needed and what this may look like. So you can see there has been this very long history of loss and damage in the UNFCCC, but mostly focused on initial scoping, on setting up institutional arrangements and technical work without any dedicated funding. And if we look at what the UNFCCC is supposed to be doing for loss and damage through the WIM, then we can see that the framework is really not meeting its goals. The WIM has three functions. The first is to enhance knowledge and understanding of comprehensive risk management approaches. The second is to strengthen dialogue, coordination, and synergies. And the third is to enhance action and support, including finance, technology, and capacity building. And both of the reviews of the WIM have found that there has been inadequate attention to this third function. So while there have been lots of discussions and reports and expert dialogues and technical papers, these have really served to meet the first two functions of the WIM. And where the WIM is lacking, and what developing countries have been very strong in pointing out, is that actual action and support to address loss and damage is far from sufficient. And this focus on knowledge and dialogue, instead of on action and support, has really resulted in loss and damage lagging behind mitigation and adaptation when it comes to practical modalities within the UNFCCC. So for mitigation and adaptation, there are very clear frameworks, ways of tracking action, and dedicated finance to support this action. For mitigation, there have been the NAMAs, the NDCs, national communications, long-term strategies. And these all provide guidance and support for countries to assess and plan for how they will reduce their emissions. There is also dedicated funding for mitigation from the Green Climate Fund, finance available for mitigation from the Global Environment Facility. For adaptation, there are national adaptation plans and national communications, which have this guidance and support to help countries to plan and report on adaptation. And there's also dedicated finance for adaptation. For developing countries in particular, these frameworks and reports and funding that are available are a major driver for developing policies and plans. However, for loss and damage, there is no corresponding framework or funding. There is no specific loss and damage report or plan. Loss and damage can be voluntarily included in national reports. And we've seen countries, SIDS in particular, that include loss and damage in their NDCs or in their national adaptation plans. But this is done in a completely ad hoc manner. There is no official guidance from the UNFCCC on how to do this. There also isn't any dedicated finance for loss and damage. And so while a country can go to the GCF, the Green Climate Fund, and ask for readiness funding to develop a national adaptation plan, this is not possible for loss and damage. And so this ad hoc and fragmented approach to loss and damage in the UNFCCC has resulted in loss and damage being far behind adaptation and mitigation in terms of action. And so all of this has contributed to lack of progress on action for loss and damage at the national scale in SIDS. Although SIDS have been advocating at the UNFCCC for decades, when we look at what these countries are doing at the national scale, there is very limited action happening. And there are three main areas of concern which have limited progress. And I'm drawing here from a paper that my colleague and I developed, which drew from analysis of nationally determined contributions, as well as interviews with SIDS. The first main issue is that there is a lack of data that would assist in detecting loss and damage in these countries. Current data collection on the impacts of climate change is fragmented and is mostly focused on economic loss and damage as a result of extreme events. So for example, many SIDS have methodologies in place to collect data and assess damages that are a result of hurricanes or large floods. But for slow onset events like sea level rise, or for extreme events that aren't major disasters, then these impacts of climate change are not being assessed. And this lack of data and lack of systematic assessment means that loss and damage may go unrecorded, particularly in less populated areas and for impacts associated with slow onset events. The second area of concern is that there are significant gaps in tracking the financial costs of loss and damage. Most SIDS are not collecting any information on how much they are spending to address these impacts of climate change. What is being captured are the immediate costs of recovering from catastrophic extreme events, again, such as hurricanes. This means that it's very difficult to determine the financial impact that loss and damage is having. And the last area of concern is that there is a marked lack of policies or mechanisms in SIDS that are focused on loss and damage. So while these countries are very clear that loss and damage is already taking place, there are very few systems in place to monitor and respond to these impacts. There is some attention paid in terms of disaster risk management, but again, this is very much focused on catastrophic extreme events. And this means that there is a major gap in approaches for non-catastrophes and impacts coming from slow onset processes. So these challenges have led to SIDS having ad hoc approaches to managing current loss and damage, and also inadequate policies to plan for future loss and damage. And the people that we interviewed were clear that national policies and approaches for loss and damage would need to be guided by the UNFCCC. So there's this sort of waiting on movement in the UNFCCC to guide how countries will address loss and damage at the national scale. And this is not surprising. We see many of these countries have been guided in developing mitigation and adaptation policy and action by these frameworks that come from the UNFCCC. And again, the funding to be able to develop national approaches for loss and damage is simply not there, which also prohibits action at this scale. And so shifting gears a bit to look at the science, while things have been moving very slowly in the policy arena, on the scientific side, there has been increasing attention paid to loss and damage. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, provides scientific inputs to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And the IPCC has been increasingly clear that negative impacts of climate change are being experienced now, and that global average temperatures, as these rise, these negative impacts will increase, and some of these will be irreversible. And so the latest reports in the 6th assessment cycle have been very strong in these assessments that negative impacts are already occurring and that they will escalate. And you can see I've highlighted in bold here, a very strong statement from the latest Working Group 2 report that losses and damages are unequally distributed and are not comprehensively addressed by current financial, governance, and institutional arrangements, particularly in vulnerable developing countries. So this is very clear language coming from the IPCC to the UNFCCC, that there is a need for improved policy, governance, and finance for loss and damage in particular. This is separate and apart from adaptation, and it really lends support to loss and damage as being the third pillar of climate action. And so my final slide, so we have this strong evidence base on the need for specific action for loss and damage. And we see that what's currently happening at both international and national scales is far from sufficient. So what's next for loss and damage? I'm hopeful that we are now moving into an era of action and support and away from the talk. The Santiago Network on Loss and Damage was established in 2019, and it is tasked with catalyzing technical assistance to implement approaches to address loss and damage. And it's expected that the institutional arrangements to ensure that the network is up and running will be finalized this year. There are also very strong expectations that the Glasgow dialogue will actually result in a loss and damage finance facility and not just result in another series of reports. And so hopefully with these latest advancements in the UNFCCC, we are moving into seeing the type of action that is needed to address loss and damage. So since that first AOSIS proposal back in 1991, we are now over 30 years out. It is very clear that adaptation and mitigation have not been enough and will not be enough to prevent loss and damage. And so hopefully we are now moving forward in action to actually address loss and damage as a critical third pillar of climate action. Thanks, and I'll end it there.
Thank you very much, Adele, for that really strong presentation and argument against knowledge and dialogue and in favor of action and support. And I think next it would be, we will hear some comments about this from a perspective in Europe, where, as you may know, the debate about climate change mitigation has perhaps fostered more action over the last several decades than in some other parts of the world, perhaps including the United States at the national level until recently. I'm sure Kelly Crawford will speak to also issues at the local level where there has been a lot going on. But let me turn now to Lisanna Gurung, who represents the European position on adaptation and is a researcher at the Open University in the Netherlands. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Todd, for the invitation and for the introduction. First of all, I would like to let you know that Adele sent me the paper that she also mentioned in her presentation, and I read it and I took notes. So I would like to just go through my observations and then also respond a bit to the presentation that she gave. So first of all, what I noted when I read through Adele's article is that the capacity building needs for the small island developing states, I think, are very clear. so in her paper, she mentioned these 3 elements where, there's a clear need for capacity building when it comes to collecting the right data on loss and damage, also making financial assessments and developing more holistic policies. And I dare see what Adele also mentioned, this link with the UNFCCC and what the convention, the climate convention, could do for SIDS. And I share the hope of Adele that what the SIDS need on loss and damage will really be provided in the future. Then I noted that the point of not that the UNFCCC at the moment doesn't provide additional and new financing yet for loss and damage. I think that's a very critical point. But it's encouraging to see the developments in the Framework Convention on Climate Change throughout the years. That at least every few years, some new body or mechanism is put in place to do something more on loss and damage. So I see a gradually maybe a slow shift in thinking on the topic, and I think it's very good that the SIDS keep on pushing for making loss and damage this 3rd pillar of climate action. Then when it comes to the content of policies on loss and damage, of course, also because this definition of loss and damage is still so different for different parties, it's also difficult to know what should exactly be in national policies on loss and damage. And also because there is not such clear guidance from the international level, it's difficult for developing island states to really put holistic policies on the table. And what I noticed in Adele's paper is that she said it's very important for these island states that they don't duplicate their efforts. What they are already doing on adaptation and disaster risk management, that could be a basis for a loss and damage policy. But of course, there are other elements that should be added to that. And I think that when the discussion on this is improved at the international level in the climate negotiations, that can provide clearer guidance for what those policies should look like. Then another thing that really struck me when reading her article was that because these island states have to deal with the negative impacts of climate change, that means that diverts the resources that they have away from other long-term development objectives, such as education or health or poverty reduction. If you hear that, then it's so obvious that there is separate money necessary to deal with loss and damage. This lack of a universal definition, I already mentioned it. Adele said, yes, there is this developed country point of view. So that's more from Europe, where I'm from. And then you have another point of view from the SIDS, of course. So that's still pretty far away from each other. And of course, it's linked to the fact that developed country parties, they try to avoid having to spend more financing on another issue linked to climate change. So making loss and damage a 3rd pillar would in that sense not be in their interest. So what they are doing is avoiding liability and compensation. That's really something they don't want to bring into the climate negotiations. And that's probably also why they never approved the request of the SIDS for this insurance mechanism. But I'm wondering, looking at the future, already in Europe now also we see losses and damages due to extreme weather events and other things related to climate change. So maybe when these losses and damages also become worse and worse in developed countries, they might understand better what cities actually need on this issue, and they might see a better, stronger rationale for actually making loss and damage a third pillar of climate action. So yeah, for the future, I think, things are going to change. Then a final point, maybe. This path forward. That was actually a question that I had for Adele, but you already answered it yourself in the presentation. There may be one small point as the last point for me. When I read Adele's article there, Adele, you mentioned that it's hard for cities to make financial assessments of their losses. And then especially because there are often many non-monetary, non-economic losses. So how can you attribute a monetary value to a loss such as having to dislocate people or a loss of a tradition, for example, in a country? I think that's a very important question. I was wondering if that question is being addressed in the UNFCCC at the moment. If that is, I was wondering about that. Maybe you have an answer. I will leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Lisanna, and we will save those questions for in a few minutes when we will open up for such questions. And if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A area, okay, in here in Zoom, and we will take them off of that area. If you as one of the participant audience members wishes to ask a question, that would be definitely the way to do it. So keep that in mind and start thinking of those. But before we get to that part of the program, I would like to introduce our other discussant, who was the Associate Director of the Department of Energy and Environment in DC, Kelly Crawford. Thank you very much for joining us as well.
Good afternoon, and thank you for having me today, Todd. I was just going to share just a little bit about what's happening here in DC with relation to our Climate Ready DC plan. So back in 2017, our Mayor, Muriel Bowser, made the commitment and pledge to make the district carbon neutral and climate resilient by 2050. And out of that commitment came our Climate Ready DC plan. And in that plan, we have 18 high-level strategies and 77 actions that the district is taking to adapt to climate change. Some of the things that we're most concerned with in DC in terms of climate change are precipitation, sea level rise. For context, DC is not has 11 inches of sea level rise in DC, and it's some of the highest rates in the world because our land is sinking along with sea levels rising. We've seen a 377% increase in flooding since the 1950s, and that's also some of the largest increases in the United States. So like today's 100-year flood event will be the future 15-year event. And we're also seeing higher heat and heat intensity. So especially in this urban setting, not only are we seeing more days above 90 degrees, but also higher heat island effects in the city. In terms of loss, in 2014, our Department of Transportation did a study on climate adaptation and assessed the vulnerability of our infrastructure. And for DC, one of the things that was noted is that the highest, the category that had the highest vulnerability for susceptibility to climate change was actually our tree canopies. DC is short on space, and as we work to achieve 40% tree canopy coverage in DC, which we're working towards, but it's also very uneven across the district, that the loss of trees to extreme weather, especially our heritage trees, really works against us as we try to limit heat island effect by expanding our tree canopy, but we're also facing loss of trees or have highly vulnerable trees in the district that are vulnerable to extreme weather and sea level rise. Another thing that we are focused on here in the district is how the interplay between our climate action and then the other co-benefits that are addressed by some of our climate action. So we're recognizing the potential for climate action to drive immediate impacts, especially health benefits for reductions in emissions, resulting in better air quality and reducing health impacts from air quality. So less loss of life associated with diseases that are attributable to poor air pollution, like asthma, lung cancer, and cardiovascular diseases. And then last but not least, I'd just like to note that, the district is also very focused on incorporating equity and environmental justice into our programs and services, and especially when we're thinking about climate change and resilience, that we want to ensure that our most vulnerable residents are considered in our climate change and adaptation decision-making. And, like environmental justice is not just about the distribution of bad stuff, like, distribution of pollution, or good stuff like, distribution of solar projects or tree canopy projects across disadvantaged communities. But it's also about the power distribution among the communities that have been historically left out of the conversation and haven't had, decision-making power as climate planning and climate action planning has been occurring. And so in the district, we have established a lot of work groups, such as our flood work group that's working on addressing flood resilience in some of our environmental justice and overburdened communities. And then we've also have a Ward 7 resiliency work group that is working to develop resiliency hubs in our first resiliency hub, which will be in our northeastern quadrant in Ward 7 to address climate resilience. And that will be a facility with on-site energy generation capacity, which will be open to the public in the event of an emergency, and be very accessible and resilient to physical hazards like flooding, so that the community have a concrete place in their community to help aid in community resiliency. And that was all that I had for DC time.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And so I think we're going to open up for questions. I think I'd like to ask the first one using the moderator prerogative, if I could, which is, I guess, questions for each of the panelists, and maybe we'll collect a few and then get back to each of you, if that's okay. I think for Adele, you very interestingly separate your discussion of loss and damage from adaptation, which makes sense, especially given your citation from the IPCC report, clearly delinking them. But I guess the question is, would they get more political benefit by being considered together, or do you think that the separation of these two concepts and sort of policies and actions will allow more attention to loss and damage? And if that's the case, how do we continue to promote that? And I guess if I would have a question for Lisanna, it would be that you seem somewhat optimistic that the loss and damage will get better attention from the UN in the future. I hope you're right. I guess I wonder what has happened in the Netherlands. If you could talk a little bit about adaptation. I mean, as some people know, the Netherlands has seemingly solved some problems by reclaiming land from the sea, right? With the sort of the most high tech, or at least that's reputedly high tech dikes and sort of seawalls and infrastructure. And I wonder, if you think that if the Netherlands can offer perhaps some sort of solution for some of the small island developing countries. And I think also for Kelly, you explicitly raised the issue of environmental justice, and I guess the issue of climate justice seems to come across all of the presentations, sort of the international level to the local level. And I guess the question is, how can venues be created? I mean, you spoke of some examples, and I guess if you could tell us a little more about how, in a general sense, how do people get a greater voice in areas where they perhaps traditionally haven't had such a strong voice, especially since climate change is still sometimes not fully given its due in the policy realm, right? I mean, at least at the national level. I mean, certainly DC, I'm sure, is different, but I guess I think that's a question to raise broadly too. Let me add, if I may, a couple of other questions. Indeed, from the CEP policy advisor, Danielle Wagner, which is, Kelly, what can individual residents do to support the tree canopy? And from the CEP director, Dan Fiorino, what leverage do the small island states have in getting other countries to pay attention to and allocate resources to loss and damage? Maybe can we go with those questions, and then as others arise, we'll put them into the next round for you. Thanks. Maybe if we could order, if people could answer in the order of presentation, that'd be good.
Sure. Thanks for those questions. All very good. I think first I'll respond to Lisana's question about non-economic loss and damage, which is a very important aspect of loss and damage. In the UNFCCC, the Warsaw International Mechanism does have expert groups that focus on different aspects of loss and damage. And one of those expert groups is specifically on non-economic losses. And so they have been doing like this research and developing reports on what do we mean by non-economic loss, how can we address it. So it's less of looking at putting a monetary value, but trying to figure out how do we respond to these non-economic losses. So for example, trauma and negative mental health effects are non-economic losses. You go through a catastrophic hurricane and you're shell shocked, and this has long-term impacts on you. Can we pay someone for that? Maybe not. Can we have in place services and resources that can help people to deal with that? We can. And so it's sort of seeing what we can do to deal with these non-economic losses. The next question from Todd on the benefits of adaptation versus loss and damage, and should loss and damage be part of adaptation? It's been very clear from the developing countries' perspective that it absolutely needs to be separated. And there's been this push for decades that it does need to be separated. So adaptation can prevent some impacts, but it cannot prevent all of them. And so what are we going to do when we experience these impacts? And I think that this becomes particularly relevant when we think about irreversible impacts or transformational. So if you think about coastal communities, at some point, adaptation is not going to be enough to prevent a community from having to leave. There's not enough, there won't be enough adaptation. And so then what do we do? And I think that's like a really good example of why loss and damage needs to be separate, simply because adaptation is not going to be enough. And then for Dan's question on what leverage do small island states have, we have collective action, which is why you see the small island states banding together as a IOSIS. So individually, I'm from the Bahamas, we're a population of 400,000. We may not have as much leverage, but banding together and being strong and consistent as we have over the past decades, it hasn't gotten us to where we would like to be, but at least, the agenda has been pushed forward, and we're hoping that this now leads to some action. And picking up with what Lisana was saying, as developed countries themselves start experiencing loss and damage, then hopefully it's a wake-up call, like we're not making this stuff up. This is something that actually needs to be addressed. So we're hopeful that we're moving into this era of action. Unfortunately, it's been spurred by climate change getting to the point where we're experiencing impacts. So hopefully that answers those questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Todd, for your questions. I would like to tell you a bit more about the Netherlands. The Netherlands has this history of, it's a country close to the sea. And in the past, there was land below the sea level that was then, that land was reclaimed from the sea, so that became new parts of the Netherlands. Then there was a big storm in 1953, and then many people lost their lives. And as a result of that event, the Netherlands started a program to build, as you said, a lot of dikes and also storm surge barriers. And that was called the Delta Works, this program. And it took them about 30 years, I think, to build all of this, especially in the most southern, the southwestern province of the Netherlands, Zeeland. That's sea land in Dutch. There they built especially these storm surge barriers. And when there's stormy weather now, they can close these barriers and then they protect the land. And this is often seen as kind of the success story of the Netherlands adapting to sea level rise. But at the same time, it's when you look further to other areas of adaptation in the Netherlands, like when it comes to heat is becoming more of a problem recently in the Netherlands, drought as well. Their policies are still lagging behind. So the Netherlands is really focused on water, and beyond water, there's not so much going on. So there you really see the difference between different topics when it comes to adaptation. And then you asked, what could the Netherlands do for developing countries like the SIDS? The Netherlands, because it has built up all this experience in dealing with sea level rise and building all this technology, they have started exporting this technology, but it's recently, when it comes to development cooperation, the Netherlands has more started focusing on the economic profits actually of this. So it's when they export the technology, it's not that they give it away for free. They kind of try to make a business deal out of it. So in that sense, I'm not sure to what extent they are in the SIDS developing projects. Maybe Adele, you have some knowledge on that. But I think they could do a lot more than they are actually doing right now. And what Adele said about adaptation is not going to be enough. The Netherlands, actually, there were already some journalists doing research on Dutch sea level rise policy and coastal adaptation policy. And they were saying, actually, there should already be a plan B on the table in the Netherlands, because like half of the country is below the sea level, and we are really artificially trying to keep it, to survive, because a lot of the land where what is below sea level is actually where's the most economic activity, like big cities like Amsterdam, Rotterdam, The Hague, they're all in area below sea level. So at the moment, the politicians don't yet want to speak about like relocating people, leaving that area, because it's really, nobody wants to talk about it. But at some point it might become reality. So we need to to start preparing for it. And if we don't want to leave, of course, there is always a hope that technology can save us. But at some point, the question is it still realistic to think in that way? So if that's reality, if politicians start to see that reality, then I think loss and damage will also become a real issue in the Netherlands, and that might give the Netherlands the inspiration to then also push maybe the issue at the international level, and then maybe create an alliance with the small island states and say, look, we are actually similar. We can help each other. But for the moment, I don't really see it yet, but I see the possibilities. And the Netherlands has actually become involved in, they started an international initiative on adaptation. Maybe there are some people in the country who see the potential as well.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'll just answer quickly just Danielle's question about what you can do to help the tree canopy in DC. It's mostly for homeowners. Don't cut down the heritage trees on your property. Take care of the trees that are in your purview. We have through our Department of Transportation, I think they have teams that plant somewhere like 80 trees a day. They're very aggressive in tree planting in DC. Developing the tree canopy just takes a long time, and that's why losing trees that are already established because of extreme weather, it really sets back our progress to the point where I think like at one point we were seeing, even though we've increased the number of trees we're planting, we see a decrease in the overall canopy because we're losing the larger, more established, mature trees that are necessary to help actually impact like heat island effect and soil erosions and things like that. With regard to equity and climate justice, energy justice, and environmental justice, we are, and so in DC, we are working, we just rolled out our equity narrative and framework for the Department of Energy and Environment. Equity is an important initiative in DC government-wide. We have our first chief equity officer in the district. However, we're seeing more and more that a lot of our equity efforts intersect with environmental justice, with everything from zoning decisions to programs and services to support COVID recovery. Equity is just, it's a design process, and it requires just the consideration of the inequitable outcomes on communities that are already overburdened. So, and they're vulnerable to impacts of systemic racism and other isms, so that we have to focus on addressing their needs and concerns and shift processes to increase the influence and the voice of vulnerable populations and communities in the district, to set up a course towards distributive justice and improve the sophistication of the systems of analysis that we use to make decisions on projects, services, and programs to advance climate justice in the district. And so one of the things that we do is that we work really hard to develop long-term community capacity to address major systemic problems. And so like I talked a little bit earlier about some of our focus groups around resiliency that led to, 2 years monthly meetings with the community to develop what these community resiliency hubs would look like, and ensuring that the voices of those most affected by climate change, those most affected by urban heat island effect, and those that are most vulnerable are part of the process of developing what those resiliency hubs will look like, but also will benefit from the outcomes of having those hubs in their communities. So there's, attacking equity on both sides, both on the process side of how do we come to the decisions, but also on the outcome side, ensuring that those who are most vulnerable to climate change, those who are most vulnerable to heat island effect or vulnerable to flooding, that their voices are elevated in the conversation and they are empowered to be active participants in the decision-making process. And I know it'll look different internationally, it'll look different where you are in DC. Many of the social and economic challenges that are faced are traced to policy and regulatory decisions, but race is consistently the indicator of greatest disparity in DC. But also we know that if race is ignored, it will, that if it's not intentionally addressed, then race is ignored as a factor when we're thinking about how impacts are affecting vulnerable communities.
Great, thank you. So it sounds like these issues of equity involving race and other issues of situations of inequality perhaps could also do to be considered much more explicitly at the international level, as it sounds like they are being considered in DC. But I guess that's I'm trying to synthesize here, but I guess I'm editorializing. And so maybe rather than conveying my view about this, I should just go thank the panelists and continue on with the questions and answers. But I thank all of you very much. This has been a very illuminating panel for me, and I think for others as well. And so, all right, let's take a couple of other good questions that have been presented. One by Lee Raymond, who says, I wonder if there's any discussion of the idea of diverting a portion of revenue from market-based emissions reduction programs, like the Clean Development Mechanism projects, toward a loss and damage fund, or what panelists think of that idea. I guess the broader question of sort of how do we finance loss and damage, which is huge, and also is sort of ties into the next question, which is from Professor Jesse Rebo, who will be a discussant in about a month on this webinar series. And his question is about how the Paris Conference, quote, agrees that Article 8 of the agreement does not involve or provide a basis for any liability or compensation. Is this just, and how can there be leverage for change if there's no liability, which in fact is the case presently? Is this just or simply an avoiding of responsibility? I guess whoever would like to take those questions would be great.
Just on the question about, I think you said talk about market-based emissions reductions program. It's not technically an emissions reduction program, but under the Clean Air Act, Title V of the Clean Air Act requires major sources of air pollution to pay certain fees, and those fees were required to use them in the implementation of the project, implementation of the program for Title V. And what we're seeing, and mind you, the Clean Air Act has been administering the Title V program for almost 50 years. The issue is that we keep seeing a decreasing revenue base from those programs, which is a good thing because we are reducing air pollution like we're supposed to be, but those emissions-based fees also shrink. And so what happens is as climate change outcomes begin to be realized, linking the funding from emissions reduction programs, it's also shrinking at the same time when you need that actual pot of money to be growing. So I think we can learn a lesson from the struggles that we're having right now with that Title V program, because we're also, like right now, we're seeing that states are struggling to keep up with doing the heavy oversight that's necessary over these large sources of air pollution. We're talking all of your power plants, oil and gas operations. These are very major operations. And as they do what we're asking them to do, as the emission standards become stricter and tighter, they're reducing their emissions, but their per ton fees also go down. And so it becomes, let's say, more rigorous on the oversight side, but also the funding that's coming in to do that work specifically is also going down. So I'm probably not a fan of that idea. But what I am a fan of is what we have in DC, which is a green bank. And the green bank is a way to use public dollars to catalyze, private dollars to address climate change, energy transition, and other opportunities to create public-private partnerships to kind of offset the upfront costs of doing resiliency work or evolving the electricity grid or evolving the building stock, so that we see an increase in funding. So we're able to amplify or magnify the public dollars that we have by bringing in private dollars.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, but I absolutely agree with Kelly. So there have been, thoughts about having money for loss and damage coming from things like the CDM. But just as Kelly said, as we need to get to net zero. And so if you're relying on funding from emissions, then that funding pot is going to dry up and needs to dry up. So that cannot be like the sole source of funding or the main source of funding for loss and damage. And then this links to Jesse's question on Article 8, which excludes liability and compensation. And Article 8 in the Paris Agreement was really a compromise article. So developing countries were adamant that loss and damage needed to be separate from adaptation and mitigation. And developed countries were adamant that liability and compensation needs to be excluded. So that's why we see this article that doesn't have a lot of teeth. And I think that has underpinned why we're not seeing any finance or any action, because there is no requirement that, there has to be funding for this. I mean, but it's not just loss and damage that's not seeing enough finance. So if we look at adaptation, it's clear that adaptation is not getting enough finance either. And it's clear that developed countries are not meeting the 100 billion per year goal. So, I mean, it's the UNFCCC, right? So it's voluntary contributions. You're not on the hook to say that you have to contribute this. So far, it has not been working. But what the science is telling us, what people on the ground are experiencing, is that what we are doing is not enough. So I don't know what's going to spur countries to act and to put up the money that's needed. We see that we can put up money very quickly when something becomes a priority, billions of dollars. So I don't know when climate change is going to be like, okay, we actually need to be serious and put the money where it's needed. But Jesse, I'm open to hearing your ideas. Thanks.
And
Great.
I'll just add to that, Adele, when you were speaking, and I was just thinking, I don't remember the exact community, but if you could imagine a shoreline community that maybe has a few or enough concentration of wealthy landowners that are willing to put in the infrastructure or invest in their homes to make them more resilient. However, maybe the rest of the town or the town itself doesn't have the resources to continue to support, the front line in terms of the waterfront line communities, regardless of the individual resources of some of the homeowners, right? There's also the resources of the municipality that's responsible for providing public services and facing these decisions on whether it's worth it, right? And you have, let's say, a wealthy contingency that is putting pressure on the municipality to invest in continuing to deliver services to an area that might be lost, but for the economic investments of certain individuals. But does that make it fair for those who don't, who have to give up their homes or who have to relocate communities? Where do the resources go?
Right. So you're raising great points about sort of this issue of the role of public versus private contributions. And seemingly, it would be good to have public and private contributions, but it seems fundamental, and it's sort of the base of this, that public will and public willingness to, invest in everybody seems to be a big part of the story. Some point to risk pooling, sort of the insurance, such as the CRIF in the Caribbean, right, as a possibility. This is where member countries contribute funds so that if there's an emergency, some sort of catastrophic event, hurricane season, they get a payout quickly of this pooled resource. But that doesn't, you still need a lot of investment, which doesn't seem to be happening, right? So I guess the question is, how do we spur people to get the view that, that this is important? And I guess that raises one final question I'd like to put on the table from a member of the audience, and that is about the increase in lawsuits, in litigation, climate litigation cases, and whether those are partially motivated by climate loss and damage as a concept, or or not? I mean, do you think that litigation is a way to get moving on loss and damage? And maybe if you have any other final comments, we would appreciate those.
Yeah, so litigation has been increasing. We've even seen some small islands trying to put together a coalition to litigate outside of the UNFCCC, just because what's happening within the UNFCCC is not enough. So I think, you know, if we continue to fail in the UNFCCC, then we will increasingly see litigation. If we don't get the private sector involved voluntarily, then perhaps you're going to see more of this suing of the oil companies, et cetera, who were well aware of what emissions were doing and did it anyway. So if we're not making progress in one way, then I think we'll see something happening in the other way. Which would be unfortunate because litigation takes quite a lot of time. It takes a lot of resources. Not everyone is going to be able to litigate. So it's not really a just way to go about addressing loss and damage. For insurance in particular, I think it's so interesting that AOSIS initially proposed insurance, and we do have the CRIF, this Caribbean Regional Insurance Fund. But we have seen the shortcomings of insurance as a way to deal with loss and damage, as it becomes so expensive and ultimately unaffordable and unavailable for people, simply because the risks are becoming so high that the premiums are so high and people can't afford it. And then even when there's a payout, the payout doesn't meet the levels of damages that were experienced. So for hurricanes and in the Caribbean, we're seeing category 5. They're even thinking about coming up with a category 6, just because the winds are getting so high. Hurricane Dorian in the Bahamas, over $3 billion in damages, and didn't even hit our main island. So we're seeing the costs of these extreme events escalate, and insurance, unfortunately, is not going to be the solution for it. So this is why I think it's so important to have these loss and damage policies and mechanisms in place to plan and to think about some of those hard questions like relocation of communities, which no one wants to do, right? So Lisanna was saying, even in the Netherlands, but it may be something that we have to do, and we really need to start thinking about these things now. Thanks.
Thank you. Anybody else care to add a final comment? Or I'm sorry, let me just read one from Jesse, a comment thanking you for your reflections. The discussion of liabilities would have to be much longer. For example, does PPP feed into this polluter pays principle? Should we have some sort of exploiter pays principle, as most vulnerabilities are produced by unjust exploitation in the past? So he raises a lot of provocative possibilities. I guess we may have to have another seminar so that we can discuss those. But would you like to make any last comments? Anybody else?
Who goes first? Yeah, I would like to say something on insurance, because I am now in this research project where we look at climate adaptation in the Netherlands, the UK, and Germany. In the UK, there is insurance when it comes to coastal risk management. And so there are properties located in coastal areas that have insurance, and there's kind of an agreement between the insurance sector and the government. And so the government is then actually, because there is insurance in the coastal area, it means that there is actually more, at the same time, there's then more built there because there's insurance, more risk is taken because of the insurance being in place. And that creates kind of a self-reinforcing mechanism where, yeah, it's actually a negative kind of effect. So yeah, that's something else I wanted to add on insurance. That it might not be the best solution.
Thank you. Kelly, would you like to make any concluding comments?
Yeah, I agree with everything that both Lizanne and Adele said, and just one of the things is just about litigation. One of the challenges is that litigation goes both ways. You do good actions, you get sued, polluters get sued, and that really just slows down and complicates, especially trying to do like climate planning in the future. Think about things like if California losing its waiver set back a lot of states that were seeking to adopt their clean car standards by 177 adoption. So all the litigation around that, it slows down states' ability to adopt or take up new actions that might be based on things that are tied up in litigation. So all of those result in real time loss to have on the ground change. And we are in a climate crisis where every minute counts. So if a rule gets tied up in litigation for 5 years, or something like the Clean Power Plan that was tied up in litigation until they finally abandoned it, the result is not only the enormous resources that go into the actual litigation, but also the time loss in developing and implementing strategies that will reduce emissions. And so it's a double whammy. And then on the other side of that, there are communities that are more able to be litigious and fight for themselves, and there are communities that are not. And so if we're relying on litigation to ensure a just transition, that's like a quick way to get to not having an equitable outcome, especially with climate justice, because these are long-term, there are long-term implications of climate change, and there's going to be long-term effects, but also the solutions are long-term solutions. And so the communities that start doing actions first, start hardening their infrastructure first, are going to be more prepared and then less vulnerable. So we'll see the less vulnerable communities be the vulnerable communities becoming more vulnerable. And that's exactly what we want to try to avoid.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for all of your presentations and comments. This has been a very informative and I guess shows that we have to build the political will, that there's no shortcuts, litigation, insurance. We need to mold opinion. And so with facts. And so that's part of what this webinar series is striving to help do. And we thank all of our colleagues for joining us, and in particular, the panelists, we thank you. And I just want to say that in this series where we're addressing these kind of issues of mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage as sort of a cohesive set of policies, trying to unify climate policy so that people think of these together and make it the association. The next of the webinars is going to try to address a real secretive element of climate policy worldwide, and it's perhaps the most important country in terms of mitigation, which is China. So we're going to talk on March 31st about understanding China's approach to climate mitigation with Joanna Lewis of Georgetown University and Laura Edwards of the Center for American Progress. So the two of them are going to speak, and then we'll also have some discussants. But for now, I want to just thank very much our panelists and all of you, and wish everybody a wonderful spring, and enjoy the wonderful weather as it seems to be coming to many of us around the world. But be mindful of climate change, but enjoy the moment, right? Thank you very much. Have a good day.
Thank you.